Benvenuti a tutti i nostri spettatori. Siamo qui insieme a Brent Buchanan, che è il direttore di Cygnal Polling, una società di sondaggi degli Stati Uniti che si inserisce in quel filone che stiamo seguendo in questi mesi per seguire le elezioni presidenziali americane del prossimo anno, chiedendo direttamente a chi se ne occupa da un punto di vista dei sondaggi americani, quindi avere una visione molto all'interno della politica americana. So, Mr. Buchanan, good morning to you. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Well, the pleasure is mine.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. So let's talk for the first thing with the Republican primary. Last April, you polled Ron DeSantis at 30%, just 7 points behind Donald Trump. Then support for DeSantis decreased, and in November, you polled him at 9%, more than 50 points behind Trump. In addition, you released a poll in which Donald Trump beat the President Biden by a wider margin than DeSantis in Florida, where DeSantis is governor. So according to this poll, it seems that Trump is stronger than DeSantis in DeSantis' home state. Can we say that DeSantis' campaign for the Republican primary failed? If so, why did it fail?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one thing that we really have to pay attention to in US politics, and I think this is playing out really all over the world. I mean, you can see it there in your elections in Italy. The norms are no longer the norms. For example, when a party is out of power, if people view the country's headed in the wrong direction, the party out of power usually can come back into power. And so these things that we could look back at in history and say, if A occurs, then B will occur, have been broken. I think Donald Trump broke a lot of that. COVID and the response to it broke a lot of that. But, yes, there really is no Republican primary now because Donald Trump is so strong. And what's really interesting is, we work for the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, who Donald Trump endorsed against him in his reelection in 2022. And we ended up winning that race by 70 points in the primary against Donald Trump's preferred and endorsed candidate. So Donald Trump is not the be-all, end-all candidate, but the problem is there has to be an alternative because politics is about choices. And in Georgia, in January, this was not a public survey, but I asked permission to share it. We actually had Ron DeSantis ahead of Donald Trump by more than 10 points in January. And so the DeSantis campaign has not necessarily failed as much as they made a huge strategic error by waiting to get into the election so late. He should have come off of his massive victory in Florida in 22 and then taken that victory and used the momentum and jumped straight into the Republican primary. But he believed that he needed to go through the entire Florida legislative session. And let me tell you, people don't care what happens in legislative sessions in states, and rack up a bunch of conservative policy victories. And that with those conservative policy victories, he would jump into the Republican primary election for president. And that entire time from January until he got into the race in May or June or whenever that was, all he did was fall down in the polls the whole time. So has he made some strategic errors? Yes. Once he's gotten in, but I think his number one error that is incorrectable was waiting to get into the race.
Thank you. It was very interesting. So a strategic error at the end. Now, let's talk about the Republican primary more in general. In last month's poll, Trump had an overwhelming lead of 52% over his major competitors, again, DeSantis, Haley, and Ramaswamy. Do you think the situation is steady in December? Could there be last-minute changes that bring surprises in the Iowa caucus next month?
Well, I'm actually headed to Iowa after this call. So I'm going to be going to several events for Vivek Ramaswamy, who is our client, even though we worked for Donald Trump's campaign in 2020 in the general election. And I'll tell you that it's going to be tough to upset Trump in Iowa because of the way the caucus works. It's not an election where you show up, cast a ballot, and walk out. You have to give up your entire evening and go stand in some high school gym somewhere for hours and literally caucus. And this is where your people are giving speeches for their candidates, and they're trying to get people at that physical location to literally come over to their side of the room and vote with their feet. And you can change. And so somebody else may get up and give a speech, and somebody may have walked over to the Nikki Haley side of the gym and then realized, well, the Ramaswamy guy I think he's the one, and walk over to the Ramaswamy side of the gym. So it's a totally different process. And when you think about it in those terms, I mean, who are the most dedicated voters? Donald Trump's voters. Those people would literally step in front of a moving vehicle for that man. And those people are going to show up and caucus in January. So the only way it's going to upset it all is if somehow you can get another 50 or 100,000 people, because not many folks, about 200,000 people participate in a caucus in Iowa on the Republican side. So you'll have to get and change essentially the composition of who is caucusing in order to change the result of the caucus. And I would say at this point, Ron DeSantis probably has one of the better chances because he has very high favorability numbers within the state, higher than Nikki Haley's by about 20 points. But then the next state is an actual election in New Hampshire, which allows independents to participate. So that's a whole different ballgame. It's not just Republicans who can vote in the primary in New Hampshire. And Nikki Haley has a leg up there because of these independents who were able to participate in that election. So you have this weird dynamic where Ron DeSantis could do well. I don't see how he beats Trump in the caucus, but then he's not going to be able to take that momentum into New Hampshire, where Nikki Haley already has a leg up. But I also don't see where she can beat Donald Trump in New Hampshire.
Okay, thank you. Now let's move to the presidential elections. In a recent poll, you shown that among Latino voters, Biden would beat Trump by 11 points, down from 32 of 2020. Do you think this is caused only by inflation and economy, or are there deepened motivation like cultural values, immigration, that could make this electorate Republican leaning in the next future?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. And one thing that is undergirding all of this is this change in politics in the U.S. of who is the base of the Democratic Party and who is the base of the Republican Party. And if you go back 30 years, the base of the Democratic Party was working class people, a lot of working class white people, and people of color. And now, and back then, Republicans were the party of the elite. They were the party of the higher educated, of the higher income individuals. And in the last few decades, these coalitions have basically swapped completely to where if you do not have a college degree, you're way more likely to be a Republican. If you have a college degree or more, you're very likely to be a Democrat. And so in that, you've got to assume that this shift is also happening within people of color, just not to the degree that the shift has happened among white voters. But this is really what's been driving a lot of the populist movements in Europe too, is this realignment of the bases of who are center-right voters and who are center-left voters. So as we look at Hispanic voters, even the ones who consider themselves Democratic still, when you ask them their ideology, are you conservative, moderate, or liberal? They're much more likely to say conservative. And so the new Democrat base is a bunch of white, wealthy, highly educated progressives and liberals. And people of color who have historically voted for Democrats by much larger margins do not identify ideologically in that same way. So you could basically say that it's not as much Hispanics or other voters of color that are coming to the Republican Party as much as the Democrat Party and who now makes up the Democratic Party has left them. And so they've got to turn somewhere that feels more comfortable, that's less progressive, that's less liberal. And in a two-party country, there's only one other option, and that's go Republican.
So you definitely see, like in 10 years, a majority of a Republican majority in the Latino voters.
I think so. I think it's headed that direction. It depends on where they are from. When we also work for Governor Greg Abbott of the great state of Texas, which, if it were its own country, would be the 8th largest country in the world, 8th largest economy in the world. And their type of Latino voters, Hispanic voters, is very different than a California Latino or Hispanic voter. And it's even different than a Florida Latino or Hispanic voter, because you have to look at country of origin, because they're not a homogenous group. It's not like white people, black people, brown people. You don't get to put them in buckets like that, because there's a lot of diversity within the Hispanic community. And, if you came from Mexico 10 generations ago to Texas, you consider yourself, they call themselves Tejanos. They don't even identify as Hispanic. And that is a very different type of voter than somebody who moved from Puerto Rico to Orlando. But if you're from Venezuela, if you're from a country where socialism or dictatorship has occurred, you're much more likely to come to the U.S. and vote Republican, because you see Democrats as bringing what you left to America. You left your country to come here because you didn't want any of that, and you see Democrats go in that direction. So while, yes, maybe nationally we'll get to a point where it's at parity or Republicans are winning a majority, but there's going to be outsized differences by states. I don't think we ever win a majority of Hispanics in California, but I think we could get to a point in Florida where Republicans are winning by 35-point margins because of the types of Hispanics that live in Florida compared to the types that live in California, as an example.
Okay, very clear. The last question, that is also the hardest, in my opinion. If we take the situation as of today, who, in your opinion, is most likely to become president next year? Biden or Trump?
That's easy. Donald Trump.
Okay.
And it's an easy answer, because in 2020, Donald Trump would have gotten reelected were it not for COVID and not for how he chose to handle it. And what I mean by that is his tone towards it. He barely lost. I mean, it's something like 25,000 votes across 4 states was the difference between him being president again and Biden winning. And also at that time, that was an election where you were either voting for or against Donald Trump. And Joe Biden was an afterthought, because he was this old dude in a basement who never left, didn't really even campaign, and still won in spite of himself. And now the election is about a true choice between Donald Trump, who has a record, and people have very strong opinions about him personally, and that's his biggest liability. And then Joe Biden, who no longer can hide in a basement as much as he probably prefers now that he could. I mean, he's the next Jimmy Carter, who led our country through a bad period. He's basically the next James Buchanan, which is a distant relative of mine, who basically brought on the Civil War before Abraham Lincoln. He's that type of president who has that type of record, who now he's stuck with that record. He's not just a blank slate in a basement anymore.
And do you think that Democrats could use abortion to avoid a referendum on Biden?
They'll try, but I don't think anybody uses and looks at the presidential race as being able to impact the abortion issue one way or the other. Is it going to affect the race for the U.S. House? Potentially. The U.S. Senate, maybe. President, no. It also matters more in a year where turnout is down, like a midterm election. And so with this being a presidential election, we're already going to have sky high turnout comparatively. So I don't think abortion matters as much in a presidential year as a midterm year, because if you weren't going to vote in the presidential election, you're not going to wake up and say, okay, well, because of abortion, now I am going to go vote in the presidential election. You either were or weren't going to vote in that election without that issue as part of the calculus.
Okay, very clear. So thank you for your answer. It was very interesting for us. We hope to have you again guest in our lives. Thank you again, and good morning to you.
Well, thank you. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas.
You too. Bye.